Hello my friends, and a very warm welcome back to my painting channel, and a very warm welcome back to the final part of my Fellowship of the Ring series. And in this video we are going to be painting Aragorn, also known as Strider. So here we are, all ready and primed, and we're going to start as always with the skin. Now if you've been following on all of the different videos that I've been painting with the Fellowship, we're going to use a mixture of the same sorts of techniques just to tie this one into the same group and make everything look a little bit more uniform so that we've got everything tied together and looking great. So starting with the skin, I'm just going to use the beige red colour just across the face and the hands. There's not a great deal of skin on this particular model, so don't worry too much about that. And then we're going to move on and straight away do the leather tunic inside. So I'm just using a colour here called Earth, and this is a really good sort of mid-tone brown, and we're going to darken this down a little bit later, and we're going to build the colours back up and things, and this is going to look really cool. Now the good thing with Aragorn, or the interesting thing with Aragorn, is we have a mixture of different sort of brown colours. So what I'm trying to do with this one is I'm trying to stay as close to the source material as possible from like the movies, like I have done with the others, but at the same time I'm also going to try to make these colours slightly different so that it doesn't look all like one big brown mash. So for his coat, looking into a lot of the different reference photos and things like that, Aragorn has a sort of dark coloured coat, so dark greenish sort of tinge to his coat. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use a military green from Vallejo. This is a really good dark base green. This is a really good colour to start off with if you're going to build up and lighten greens. And this is going to allow this jacket, this coat, to look a little bit different, and again just have that subtle hint of this green without going too extreme and painting this really bright colours. Because if you followed some of the other videos, you'll know that we keep in some of these colours a little bit more muted, a little bit more toned down, because we just want to try to match the videos and the sort of style and things that they've got going on there. So because these are all just base colours, I'm just using my basing brush. You don't have to be overly precious or overly careful with doing this, but I would suggest being just a little bit more careful, or just a little bit careful not to get this onto colours you've already done. Now we're going to use a dark grey colour now just for the leggings, and also for the sash that he's got going just through the middle there as well. And we're using this dark grey colour because, again, looking at references and things like that, we've got a few different colours, but it doesn't look like there's too much brown going on sort of in the trousers or the legging area. It looks like it's a really dark sort of grey colour. So this is why we're going with this dark grey blue. And I'm using this dark grey blue because the blue will give you a little bit more colour to pull back out, so this will give a little bit more depth to the miniature, a little bit more colour, and sort of break up those colours a little bit as well. And we're going to use a dark green grey from AK Interactive. Now this is a very muted green colour. This is a interesting colour to sort of build up from, but pretty much we're just going to use this on the bedroll. And again, this one's going to be a brighter colour by the time we finish, and that's just to break up from that dark green and the light green, just to separate some of these parts. So we're going to use a flat earth then across the boots. So as I was saying, we're just trying to make sure that we're using a couple of different browns so that this ends up being slightly different shades and becomes a little bit more interesting to look at, because we don't want everything to be the exact same colour. Now we're also going to paint the bow this colour, because if you've watched any of my other videos or watched me painting before, I tend to use this colour quite a lot for things like wood. So this is really good for wood grain, which I've used previously in the past on the handles of Gimli's axe as an example. From there we're going to use one of my favourite colours. This is dark rust. This is a really dark brown, and this is a great base colour as well. So this is a colour that we can build up into multiple different colours, giving us a really good sort of base colour to begin with. So for this we're going to paint the hair. We're going to be as careful as possible to paint the little goatee beard as well. And then we're also just going to cover one or two of the areas that we're going to want the leathers to be, so things like the belt and things like that. As I say, you want to try to be as careful as possible when painting just around the facial hair, trying to leave that little bit of skin just through where the mouth is and the lips are, because that's going to build the depth and the character on the model's face a little bit later. So as I say, just painting this just across those leather straps as well, just for the belt. This is going to give you a really good base area where we can build those colours back up really different and really nice in comparison to the hair. As an example, the hair will be a different colour to the belt, which will be different to the leathers of the boots and things like that. Now, looking at the reference photos as well, he does have some dark leather straps just going around the boots. So where we have the lighter leather straps, just going to take our time to paint these darker straps as well. And of course, the dark leather straps holding the bedroll together is also going to be the same. And I'm just going to quickly just do the same colour for the quiver, for where the arrows are kept. Once that's all dry, I'm going to move on to one of my other favourite colours. This one is a tenebrous grey. This is a really dark colour. As I always say when using this, if you don't want to use this or you don't want to buy into like the like different brands or anything like that, you could just use a nice flat black colour. It will do exactly the same job for you. I just find this paint moves quite nicely and dries quite quickly as well. So I'm just going to paint anything that I'm going to paint up in the metals like this. So the sword, the small part of a buckle just across the belt, and some parts of the metal around the quiver as well, just on the back of his coat. This is going to be a great base where we can build up the non-metallic metals from later. If you're looking or if you're wondering how to do the non-metallic metals, I'll show you quickly later how I'm doing them on the sword. But if you want a more in-depth video on how I've managed to do it with this particular model or this particular set, my Boromir video in this particular range is really in-depth in how I'm doing the non-metallics. So that's probably the best video for you to check out on how to do that. From there, I'm just going to use a small amount of bone white. This is a really cool, great looking, creamy white colour. I'm just going to paint the tips of the feathers, or the feathers from the arrows poking out of his quiver here on the back. This is a good way of separating a few of those details out from the hair and things like that, so this will keep the hair and bits looking slightly different. We're going on to one of my favourite moments. I love painting miniatures and I love seeing all of the details and I love building the colours up and all of these different things. But one of my favourite things in the world is applying a wash. There's nothing more satisfying in the world than applying a nice wash onto your miniature. Now what I've done is I've painted this miniature using a lot of earthy colours. So these earthy greens, earthy browns, all these different things. So this means when I'm using my wash, I can simply just use a single wash. I don't need to use multiple washes. You can if you want, if you prefer to paint that way, but on this particular miniature and most of the set, to be fair, a lot of what I've done is trying to make things as easy as possible, as simple as possible, so one single wash is enough. And this Agrax Earthshade is a really great earthy colour. It's an earthy tone shade, so it brings those colours down, giving us a really good platform as to where we can build those colours back up from. It also ties those colours together really well. So once all of that is dry, so we put that to one side and we've let that dry down quite nicely. We're just going to move back and we're going to start again with the skin. I'm using my really extreme detail brush here and I'm going back to the original skin colour, which was that beige red. Now the cool thing is, where that shade and that Agrax Earthshade has dried, you can just see we're starting to pick out some of those details of the face. So we don't need to do too much work on this. By going back with the original colour, because the Agrax Earthshade has darkened the face slightly, using this original colour now, we're building the colour back up in the cheeks, the nose, the forehead, as you can see. We're starting to build depth in that face so quickly and so easily, so we're not spending hours and hours and hours mixing, blending and all these things. It's making something really quick, really easy. So for the next step up, I'm going to use basic skin tone and beige red. Again, if you've watched the channel, this is a technique that I use quite a lot. Now I'm mixing these completely, half of one, half of the other. So that means it's about a 50% mix of each, so just one splodge of each paint. I'm also adding a small amount of water, which is normally sort of 1 or 2 drops, just to thin the paint down enough that it moves off the brush nicely, but it also blends and dries down quite well into the miniature as well. Now I'm being a little bit more careful as to where I'm focusing this, because this is a highlight, so I'm being a little bit more careful around those cheeks and around the forehead, just to build up that illusion that the light is catching on some of those more raised areas of the face. And I'm also doing the same just across the hand, as you can see, just trying to paint all of the knuckles, all of the fingers individually, and just around, down and around that thumb. Just like so. So once that's done, we're going to move back then and use earth. So we're going back onto this earth colour just to build up the leather jacket on the inside, or his leather tunic on the inside. So I'm just building this up, and again just using a nice thin detailed brush, and I'm just going to follow the pattern, and I'm going to follow the way that the folds of this tunic fall onto the miniature. So these are falling downwards, so I'm using the same strokes, the same brush strokes down this miniature so that it builds that cohesion, so it looks quite natural and it looks quite normal. It doesn't look quite out of the ordinary to have sort of sideways brush strokes across a miniature that's flowing sort of down and things like that. So it's always good to just paint across or paint down those folds and just paint along those lines. Now I do tend to say sometimes in my videos that it's like painting by numbers at this stage. It's like painting by numbers, and what I mean by that isn't the numbers of the paints or anything like that. What I mean is an old painted by number set is they give you the numbers on what to paint. So once we've already got our highlighting area, because those folds and those creases are already there, what I mean by painted by numbers is we're just painting on those creases because they're already there. So we're just building up what's already there. We're building up the details that are already there. Now from there I'm going to add a small amount of light earth to the same mixture, to this earth mixture. And as you can see with my palette, I'm using probably about 2 or 3 blobs of the earth to 1 small bit of light earth. And as you can see, I'm adding plenty of water to this mixture as well. And then I'm just going to build up exactly like I was just saying about the painting by numbers. I'm now going to be a little bit more careful as to where I'm picking out on those folds and on those raised parts of the miniature. So as you can see, this tunic has got a few different parts that are raised, a few folds and a few bits that are adding to the dynamic pose and the movement of the miniature. So this is where we are just building up those highlights. Again, with these paints being nice and thin, this is going to be perfect because as this starts to dry down, this is going to blend quite nicely into the colour below, and it's going to give us that really awesome looking level of depth as well. Sometimes I will, as you can see, just add a little bit of stippling, especially on the leathers, because a little bit of stippling, which is just dabbing the tip of your brush onto the model, a little bit of stippling is great because it adds that little bit of a roughness to leathers, because leathers are never pristine and brand new. They always have this pattern, this sort of texture and things like that. So that's all I'm doing this time, is just adding another very, very small bit of light earth onto the model, into the mixture, sorry, so that this then becomes a little bit brighter again, and I get another step up of a highlight. When I say a small amount, I mean a very small amount. It's completely up to you sort of how much you want to highlight the miniature and how much you want to build up the model's colours and the model's textures and things like that. So yeah, it's something that you learn as you go. It's something that you build as you go, and it's something that you tend to sort of become a bit more natural with as you're painting. So the more you paint, the more sort of experienced you get, the more used to doing these things you become. And again, with this extreme highlight, as you can see, a lot of the time what I'm doing is using that dabbing that dabbing technique, just to kind of create a little bit of that texture again, so that we're making that leather look a little bit rough. It's not perfect, it's got a little bit of scratches, scrapes, and it's a little bit battered and worn, which is great. And once all of that area is dry, we're moving on then as well back to that military green. And again, we're going to do the same thing with this as what we've just done with the leather tunic. So we're going to build up the base colour that we already had, and we're going to leave the shade just sitting in those recess points, in those bits where the folds and the creases are sort of built up on the model, and we're just going to build these colours back up. And as you can see, with this nice thin paint as well, this is taking to the miniature quite nicely. It's starting to build that vibrancy quite nicely, but without taking over the miniature completely. So it's giving that miniature a really nice highlight, a really nice sort of build of colour and tone, but we're also keeping that darker shade as well. So what I'm doing with the arms as well, as you can see, I'm focusing the lighter green mostly across the top area of the arm. So I'm leaving the underneath just that little bit darker, because that's building the, again, that illusion that the light is catching on top of the miniature, that the darker areas underneath is where the light isn't sort of catching as much. That's going to be a great sort of little sort of added subtle effect later. So we're going to use the military green, and I'm going to add a small amount of medium olive. And again, this is 2 blobs of military green to 1 blob of medium olive. So that is a 2-to-1 ratio. And that is literally because medium olive can be quite bright. And as I was saying at the beginning, I want to try to keep this coat looking a little bit darker. So we're using the highlight, and then we're just going to build up some nice thin layers. And again, by thinning this down, this is going to slightly increase that vibrance again, just in certain areas. And again, as you can see, it's already starting to show some of the colour on those areas where we think the light is going to catch. So I'm not going to paint any of this on the underneath of the coat, and the same with the underneath of the arms, because we're building that illusion that this is just where the light is catching the coat. So just being careful to pick out the creases and the creased areas and things like that. And again, you don't need to be too worried about your brush strokes, because again, we're wearing like a big sort of rough, worn coat, so we don't need to worry too much if the brush strokes are a little bit sort of rough and ragged, because that adds to the texture. So we're going to go back with that dark blue grey as well. So this is for the leggings and the sash, if you remember. So we're just going to paint these leggings now, and again, exactly the same. Like I said, painting by numbers. So that's all we're doing, is we're just picking out all of those creases, picking out all of those folds. So we're picking where we want the highlights to be, and leaving the sort of areas where the shade is sat, where it's just turned things that little bit darker, that little bit rougher. And the same thing on the sash, as you can see, we're just painting along the lines and along those folds. So keeping the brush strokes the same direction that those folds are going, so that creates that element of movement, that dynamic sort of way that the pose is moving through, and he's really swinging this sword across, you know. And that's giving us some really, really cool depth. So for the first highlight, or for the highlight for this one, I'm just going to add a small amount of the blue-grey pale. And the same thing again, this is 2 blobs of the darker to 1 blob of the lighter. So that is 2 of the dark blue-grey and 1 of the pale blue-grey. And that is again just to build a subtle highlight and making sure that these paints are nice and thin again. And as you can see, I don't mind those little rough, scratchy kind of brush strokes, because that's adding to the worn nature and the sort of effect that we want on the model as well. And just doing the same thing down the sash, being really careful just to pick out those areas that look like they are catching the light a little bit more. And this is how we're building the depth. So it's just simple. So it's base coat, shade, base coat, highlight, and then you can push those highlights multiple times if you want. It's up to you how far you want to go. So then we're going on to the flat earth, and just going back to repaint those boots. We're going to be careful with the boots now. There's quite a lot of folds and detail already in the boots. The shade has done a wonderful job of picking out all of these different details. So instead of painting over those details, we're just going to paint just on the edges and just on those folds. So you're going to paint those highlighted areas. Now for the boots, I'm not going to go further beyond than just this one coat. You can, if you want, build up highlights to this. If you've watched any of my other videos, you will know that the perfect highlight to this is a beige brown, and I will use that a little bit later on the bow, but that is completely up to you guys if you want to really pick out some of those creases and folds in the boots as much as you like. Personally, I tried to keep them a little bit darker, because I find a lot of Aragorn's clothing in the movies tends to be quite dark, and especially for this kind of set as well, where we're in Balin's tomb. So as you can see, I've done the boots, and I'm just going to build up the colour across the bow as well. With the bow, the good thing to do with this is to just be as careful as possible. Don't worry too much about those brush strokes again, as I said, because that's going to add that really cool detail and effects to the wood grain, like we've done previously. So you're going to build a bedroll back up using the AK Interactive dark grey green, and the same thing again, just painting on those folds, painting on those creases, as you can see. Not worrying about using dabbing techniques or the brush strokes, because that's adding to the miniatures, adding to the quality of a hand-painted model as well. Just being careful not to get this on the leather straps, so just trying to be as careful as possible that we place this in the right areas, so just like this. And then for this one, we're going to use a little bit of dark green mixed into this one. Now, dark green is a really intense colour, so even by using very small amounts, this will make a very intense, bright, vibrant colour. So I would suggest using a very, very small amount to begin with, and then building up from there, which is always a good idea when you're mixing paints, is to start off small and then mix up and build up as you go. So for me, I'm just trying again, like we've done previously, just to pick out some of the highlights, some of those details, some of those folds. This colour does change the colour or the base colour of that dark grey green slightly, and that's cool because that's going to give us, as I said, a nice different green to look at from the coat as well. So if you've watched me do hair before, you'll know this technique as well. This is mixing a small amount of the dark rust together with a very small amount of the leather brown. So dark rust is my base tone, and again this is probably this is a 2-to-1 mix. So this is 2 blobs of dark rust for 1 blob of leather brown, because from there then we can always add more leather brown and create more of a highlight. And like in previous videos, I am using a extreme detail brush, and I'm trying to paint the hair strands by hand instead of dry brushing. Because we've spent so much time painting the miniature, dry brushing can be a little bit fiddly, and it can also be quite difficult to control on times. So if we dry brush the hair, we might get some of that brown on the face. So hand painting, we're going to get this a little bit more sharper and a little bit more detailed. You're going to notice that hand painted equivalent on this hair. So as I said, once we've done the first highlight, we add in more of that leather brown into our mix. So we've gone from 2-to-1 blob just to a half and half, so 1 blob each, so that this then becomes a better highlight. So this is 50% of each paint then. And again, as you can see, I'm just hand painting all of those hair strands just to create more of a hand painted feel to the model and give me more control as well while I'm painting. Now for me personally, what I've done here is I'm just adding a thin layer of strong tone. So I'm using a thin layer of strong tone, but only on the inner tunic, so just on the leather tunic just inside. And the reason for this is because the colours that I had used when I built this up, the colours are great because this changes or gives you a different kind of brown to look at. But I personally found that he looked a little bit too much like a Jedi. So by adding this thin layer of dark tone, strong tone, by adding this thin layer of strong tone onto the model, this is going to tone that brown back down just slightly, so that it's going to look more leather. So we're only using it on that part of the model. Once that's done then as well, we're going to move on and just do the leathers. Again, this is a technique that I've used throughout all of the same set. So we're using the AK Interactive leather brown, and we're just going to dab a thin layer of this across the leathers, which is the quiver on his back and of course his leather belts. Then we're going to go for a half and half mix, so 50% of deep brown and 50% of leather brown, and we're going to go in with a more fine detail brush, which is going to really try to pick this out as much as possible. And again, I'm using a dabbing motion to create that element of worn out, battered leathers like we have done previously in the past. And again, just the same thing across the quiver, as you can see, just dabbing this paint on. Doesn't matter if we leave in little gaps, doesn't matter if we leave in little bits of the colour from underneath, because that's what's creating the illusion of the depth and the scratches and the beaten and worn effect. So that's kind of what we want. That's the technique that we're looking for. Once that bit's dry, we're also then going to use just the deep brown on its own. So with this one now, this is a very vibrant colour, so I'm going to be very sparing with this and just choose where I want this to be. As you can see, just trying to catch some of the raised edges, some of the higher up edges on the leather. And of course, with this on the quiver, you can use this, because we're using such a fine detail brush, you can use this to create little scrapes and scratches like this by using your the tip of the brush just to scrape little sort of worn out little scratches and things like that. And this is going to have a really cool sort of effect to the depth of the quiver. So as I said earlier, I'm going to use a bit of beige brown just to build up the colour of the bow. So we're just going to use that dabbing technique again, just across the bow, just to build a little bit more tone and depth, but also to give us a little bit more to look at, because we don't want sort of the bow to be just one flat colour and that's that. We kind of want to build up those sort of wood grain effects and things like that. We're moving on to the sword and the non-metallic metals. So we're going to start with the anthracite grey, which is just a blue grey. So this is a very sort of blue colour. This is my base colour when I'm doing the non-metallics, and that's purely just because this creates a very cool, cold look to the steel, which is great, because this is a good base colour that we can then build these tones up from. Again, like I said, if you want to go more in depth in the non-metallic metals, the Boromir set from this set is the best one to look at, because I spend a bit more time going through and showing you how I'm getting the effect. And from there we're going to use ash grey, which is the darkest grey that we're going to use on this, and we're just using a thin layer and a dabbing motion, and we're trying to pick where we want this grey to be. Now the cool thing is, by using a very thin layer, you don't have to wait for it to dry. See how you can just use a damp brush and just pull some of that paint back off and move some of that paint around, and then that should build up the tone and texture. So I'm doing the same thing now, just going in with the graphite on top, so that's the lighter grey. And as you can see, just using that dabbing effect, and you can see just how thin the paint is then. So as this dries, it's not going to dry down as extreme as it looks. Silver grey then is a perfect next step up, because this is where the magic happens, because this silver grey is the first part that creates the first sort of stage to the highlight of your sword. So this colour is the perfect colour ready for your whites to go on and really boost the vibrancy of your sword. So once your silver grey has dried down, you're going to want to use your off-white then, just to be a little bit more specific where you want this colour to be. So just across the very tip of the hilt, very edges, as you can see, of the hilt, and then just choosing just little areas where we want this to be. So we're going to have the highlights just across these areas. And then once all of that is done, we're going to use the white itself. Now the AK Interactive white is part of the intense range, so it is very, very intense. We're switching over to our fine detail brush, and we are very much picking out just the extreme details. As you can see, just running the edge of my brush across the edge of the sword, just to make the sword look like it's got a really, really, really sharp edge. It doesn't have to be a perfect line, because that again creates the illusion that there's little nicks and dents in the sword as well, which is exactly what we want to do. And as you can see, I'm just doing that across the top there as well. And with that, you can also use the very tip of your brush to create little sharp areas and lines and scrapes and scratches as well. All in all, that is Aragorn complete. And he should look something like this. And he fits perfectly into my full set of the Fellowship of the Ring. It has been a really cool, really different sort of project to do, and I have absolutely loved every minute of it. It has been great to paint each individual character separately with you guys, and it has been awesome for you guys to sort of come through and watch and join in and paint some of your models with me as well. I've loved doing this, and I've really enjoyed every minute of it, and Aragorn fits perfectly. I can't wait to put this set now into my display cabinet and keep this for years and years to come. As always, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. You'll have to let me know what you think of the whole set and all of the videos in the comments below. I would really love to hear from you all. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the likes. Thank you for the support. Thank you for the comments. I really do appreciate it all. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys on the next one.